I'm very excited today to be joined by my very first panel on electric insights, and I'm going to ask that panel to introduce themselves now. Grace, would you like to start?
Thanks very much, James. So hi everyone, I'm Grace Carroll, and I'm the head of Home, Workplace and Destination EV Charging Policy at the Office for Zero Emission Vehicles. And yes, that is the longest job title I have ever had. So I'm very excited to be here today. I'll be talking about the exciting announcement of the building regulations, which I think has been well anticipated for a fair while now. So I'm looking forward to talking with everyone and answering questions.
Fantastic. And Kieran?
Yep, thanks, James. My name's Kieran Walker. I'm the Technical and Sustainability Director for the Home Builders Federation. I've worked in the PLC house building space for 17, 18 years. And today it's good to come along and obviously see that we've got some information published from government recently. HBF worked very closely with OZEV, as they were formerly known, and the industry on the consultation response for this new building regulation when it closed in October 2019. So very keen to see this, very keen to sort of answer any questions really from the residential sector as well as to how this will affect us moving forward.
Absolutely fantastic. That's Kieran. We'll come on to Rob Hughes.
Yeah, hi guys. Rob Hughes, Head of Built Environment at Pod Point. Also a fairly long job title. Essentially, I lead a team of consultants that support the developers and their various consultants involved in delivering the charge points into these developments. So lots of work ahead of us. I'm really excited to continue supporting the current client base.
Great stuff. And finally, Symon.
Yeah, so good morning, afternoon even. Symon Gray, I'm Head of Networks, so for Energy Assets Networks. So I look after an IDNO business. For anybody who doesn't know what an IDNO is, it's an independent distribution network operator. Roughly IDNOs currently take about 75 to 80% of all new connections, so domestic connections, I&C. So we're playing a very big part, hopefully, in how the future holds for networks.
Great stuff. That's absolutely fantastic. So a superb panel with us today. Now, the first question I'm going to ask is I'm going to come to Grace, and I'm going to ask you, Grace, a very tricky one here. I'd ask you for a whistle-stop tour, a quick overview of the changes to the building regs and the proposed new legislation.
Of course. So the building regulations, which were announced as policy in the consultation response last week, are focused on future-proofing buildings, new buildings, and those that are undergoing a major renovation, which is defined as in other parts of building regulations as over 25% of a building surface area being renovated. They will be future-proofed with charge point infrastructure. So largely the emphasis we have is on charge points themselves, but also on cable routes. So it is a lot easier to install charge points in future. So when it comes to residential buildings, which I think will be of particular interest to the panel and your audience, James, when a new building is set up, the goal and the policy is to have a new charge point for every dwelling for that new residential building. And that is not just new homes and houses, but it is also for flat buildings as well. So there are some relevant exemptions, as there are for a lot of policies like this, to make sure everything is proportional. But when it comes to a residential building which has more than 10 parking spaces, we're also not just going for the one charge point per dwelling, we're also going for cable routes in all further spaces as well. A large aim of this policy is to really meet this new market, this growing demand early on. Charging availability and charging anxiety is a big reason we see people citing about anxiety around EV uptake. And the majority of people we have found do charge at home. And so by putting this in place and also using the cable routing to make it easier should retrofitting want to occur, we're trying to have all future buildings ready for this EV transition. It also does apply to new non-residentials as well. So new supermarkets, new workplaces, they will also have a minimum one charge point requirement and requirements for cable routing as well. it is rather broad, so I hope that was whistle stop enough for you, James.
I thought that was rather good. I guess the one point of clarification I would add is that it's those buildings, it's bays associated with a dwelling. So if there is not going to be a parking space, clearly there's not a mandatory charging point.
Yes, no, that is
it.
absolutely right. It's associated parking spaces.
Exactly right. So that is a key distinction. But I thought it was an absolutely superb summary of actually a relatively complex topic. So thank you very much indeed for that. So I'm now going to come to Kieran. Kieran, obviously you represent the Home Builders Federation. You mentioned you were very involved in the consultation process during the formulation of these regulations. Clearly, you're supportive of the EV agenda, and it's clear that this is going to benefit EV drivers and enable more drivers to switch to electric vehicles as they arrive at their new homes, etc. But how do we balance the benefits we're seeking to get with this with the potential burden on landowners, home builders, etc.?
I think that's a good question. To be honest, I think until we see the regulations come into force, that balance will be tricky to manage. Obviously, I think Symon, who represents an IDNO today, they're going to be key to these discussions, and they're going to be key to the discussions early on at feasibility stage of a scheme. When developers are looking at viability and negotiating with landowners, we're talking about Part S of the building regulations coming into force. And Grace, correct me if I'm wrong, we're talking about probably June next year that this is going to come into force and be present within the building regulations agenda. At the same time, we've got a new building regulation in the form of Part L and F. Now, these discussions need to be had as early as possible to look at the best solutions in order to avoid jeopardising viability of schemes as well. Within the proposals, within the building regulations, as Grace mentioned, we've got some exemptions in there on costs, so £3,600 per plot exemption for on-site metering, I believe. Now, obviously, our industry, we want to take forward EV charging, we want to take it wholesale as well, but we have to be mindful of the impact on infrastructure. We have to be mindful of the ability to secure points of connection early when we're having these discussions with landowners and negotiating those deals, because we've seen in the past, the costs of off-site reinforcement and on-site reinforcement can potentially, in some instances, negate the viability of a scheme moving forward as well, if you've got to cross third-party land as well. So it's about managing that balance, as you say, James. As an industry, we want to do it because actually, why buy a new build home which hasn't got up-to-date technology in it? You want that sort of parity. If you're going to buy something brand new, you want brand new technology within that as well moving forward. So we as an industry want to do it. We just don't want to be hankered. We don't want to be encumbered by third-party land approvals, by reinforcement costs, and the fact that actually we can't secure energy to the site as well, not just for electric vehicle charging, but also for Part L 2021, and then moving on to the Future Home Standard, where in all likelihood we're going to be putting significant more demand on a property by the introduction of air source heat pumps or heat pumps generally, EV charging points, battery storage, photovoltaic panels as well. That the whole concept of the electric house is coming, and it's coming quickly. So we need to understand the implications early on substations, primary substations, points of connections, on-site and off-site reinforcement as well.
Kieran, that's a great answer. And you've immediately zoomed into grid being absolutely critical to not only electric vehicles, but the electrification of heat, etc. And I'd like to come to Symon now, and bring Symon in on that network side. How do you determine what the required capacity is going to be when we bring in these new building regs? Who's responsible for managing the infrastructure within those shared communities, etc. And what role can the DNOs and IDNOs play?
Each DNO or IDNO has a design standard, so that stipulate what the requirements are for a particular type of house, whether it's an air source heat pump or whether it's got an EV car charger. So they're stipulated in their design standards. Currently, every DNO throughout the country has a different standard. As IDNOs, we're also part of Independent Network Association, and together we've come up with our own LV design standard currently. So all the IDNOs are now singing from the same hymn sheet, so to speak, with the requirements for our network and how it's going to cope with that increase in demand. So we've made allowances for what we believe to be factually correct on ADMD values, after diversity maximum demand. Sorry for anybody that doesn't know. So these are values, basically, you look at a particular house type and you'll nominate a value for that capacity of that house. There is a bit of diversity applied across the network to allow for people not being on or using certain capacity and other people that don't. Ultimately, the management of the network comes down to the IDNOs and the DNOs. So everything that connects obviously has an impact, whether that's generation or import capacity, and all these factors do take a very, very big difference on how that network's constructed. As Kieran will know, there's a lot of factors, especially with air source heat pumps, that are going to dramatically change points of connection, and how that's going to be evaluated, and the impact that you can have. You can have certain developments that go from a relatively cheap connection point and then you get other developments because of constraints to the network that then become quite costly to the developer, and it could mean that increase in capacity doesn't allow for the development to go ahead because you won't be able to sell houses to equate for the point of connection. There's a particular site in Scotland that I'm aware of where the reinforcement costs, if they break certain boundaries, is about £7 million. The whole development's around 280 houses, so £4 million on 280 houses is quite a chunk of change.
Yeah, absolutely, certainly. And I guess that really highlights the importance of that £3,600 threshold. And one of the other critical things is the diversity you talk about. And that's, we see the industry learning the way EV chargers particularly are used and increasing diversity. I just want to follow up, I guess. I don't want them to take the temperature in the IDNO sort of space. Do you see this as a very exciting opportunity or potentially a real challenge for your industry, or both?
I think both. I think not a lot's changed in distribution of electricity in 30, 40, 50 years. So certainly the impact that different technologies are having is certainly giving people a good time to scratch their head and see what's coming and see how it can impact. So it is an exciting time, but then you've also got the other element of, can the networks cope, existing networks, with the technologies? Gas boilers, for example, you won't be able to buy a gas boiler in however many years, I can't remember the time frame now, but there's old networks that are situated to ground, designed for houses that traditionally are electric lighting and power, and gas heated. So DNOs have certainly got more of a threat to their network from these emerging technologies than, say, IDNO networks, which are generally built a bit more robust just because of the very nature of how electricity has changed over the last sort of 15, 20 years. Luckily, greener technologies are coming out. Low watt light bulbs have made a difference, as strange as that sounds. Anything that becomes more energy efficient, dryers, refrigerators, TVs, all reducing that overall usage of a house. So there is these impacts, but then you've also got, like I say, you've got the impact of air source heat pumps and EV chargers. I think a lot of EV chargers will be off peak, and what that then does is that potentially shifts the peak period from being, say, from 5 till 8 to potentially midnight till 4 o'clock in the morning. So that's quite a drastic change. So that's something that's going to be looked at. So whether the tariffs that are currently provided will change just to fit that model, we don't know currently.
No, indeed. EDF tariff, I think, starts at 12:30. There's a couple of other 12:30. We're starting to see that in the real data we see as becoming a material peak. Rob, I'd like to come to you now. Obviously, we're Pod Point. We look to install infrastructure. It's our reason for being, and it's the way you and your team make your living, etc. But you really don't want to be seen as just an unnecessary burden to the built environment, etc. So I want to come to you for a bit more information on the longer term benefits of providing this infrastructure. Is there any risk of future technological redundancy if we fit the charging points today? And then finally, are you confident that we can manage the impact on the grid that Symon was referring to?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, James. So I think we're really starting to see that sentiment in the new resident consumer base is changing. So we're definitely seeing anecdotal evidence now from the developers that we work with, that customers are either expecting or certainly requesting and asking for charge points. Slightly provoked by the change in legislation. We've definitely seen an uptick in the past 10 days or so, following decent media coverage. But prior to that, certainly we were still seeing that. So we've definitely got the development community, whilst we're kind of edging our way into the regulations, a major percentage of them are looking to move before that because of the sentiment of the customers they're trying to meet the demand of. So I definitely think there's it's been really well received from the buyers of the homes. In terms of the point around whether this kit is good for the future or not, there's often a misconception that the car batteries are going to get bigger, and therefore we're going to need a faster charge in order to be able to meet the requirement of a bigger battery. And James, as you very well know, it actually isn't the inverse relationship. So if your battery is bigger, then the requirement to charge it quickly in an acute moment in time may well reduce, because actually our driving behaviour doesn't change. It's just that we've got more resilience in the size of that battery. So to kind of answer that question, the 7 kilowatt charge points that are being mandated now are sized appropriately to find the balance between the speed the customer wants, the cost that they want to ultimately pay for that infrastructure and to bear in terms of ongoing maintenance and management, and the impact that it has on the grid. So we're trying to find the right balance between all those dynamics, and I'm fairly confident that we have done so.
Yeah, to put this in petrol terms, you're talking about charge rates and battery sizes. I always say how far you drive is determined by the distance between your destinations, not the size of your fuel tank. If you buy a car with a large fuel tank, you don't find yourself suddenly lapping the UK because you just had to. And just a gentle top up every night actually works very nicely, as you pointed out. Grace, I'd like to come back to you now. This conversation very quickly moved on outside your realm. Now, when you announced your job title, you pointed out that you're responsible for what we class as about, I think, sort of 97% of what we class the energy flow going to chargers: home, work, destination, public, etc. That's a lot of it, but still, this is a bigger piece. We're talking about net zero in its totality. We've already started talking about air and ground source heat pumps and things of that nature. This is one part of the net zero strategy, isn't it? And I want to come to you with a comment on how you feel that sits in with the work your colleagues at BEIS, etc., might be doing to bring forth electrification of heat and those sorts of things. And then how the policy sits with the wider EV uptake goals and policies.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think, as you say, it is quite telling that it moved on to this much wider context, because electric vehicles are so broad ranging. It's a new market in so many different areas. So the Office for Zero Emission Vehicles, it is joint between Department of Transport and BEIS for that very reason, because one can't really operate without the other because of these considerations about grid, but also the innovation behind this fast moving market. And really, I think that OZEV's wider work is a lot of the focus is on road or on street parking as well, because you mentioned the figure of 97%, which I can't really speculate on, to be honest. But
that's our estimate, internal
yes,
point estimate.
Absolutely, and I think that's I think that what some of the feedback we saw was about what about those that don't have this associated parking space at their homes, and that's why there is a lot of work also going on at OZEV about on-street parking and grant funding. So I think that my team doesn't operate in a silo on this point, and in big collaboration not only with BEIS but the Department of Levelling Up and Housing and Communities. I hope I got my acronym order right there, sorry. So we've had to work very closely with them as well to make sure that it is all working towards this wider 2050 net zero goal. And electric vehicles transition is one point of the Prime Minister's 10-point plan. But even around that, the number of teams involved in the different work streams in terms of charge point design, grid capacity, and then my team, as you say, which the focus is very much about getting those charge points available and proportionally, available in the right places for people in home, workplace, and at their destination, which is sometimes a bit of an enigma term, but really it's so that if you go and do your big shop somewhere, you can have an assurance that actually you will be able to top up if you need to whilst out and about as well. And this workplace and destination aspect, we also hope addresses some of these people that have an EV or want an EV and might not have associated parking where they're living at the moment.
Great stuff. Thank you very much indeed for that wider view. My final question on this section, I'd like to put to the remaining three panelists, starting with Kieran. The conversation's quite quickly shown that there's a degree of complexity in this area. We've talked about grid, we've talked about other loads, all those sorts of things. This is not simply buy the kit, put it in and walk away. There's a degree of planning that needs to take place. There's load management, there's things of that nature. So the question I'd like to ask to Kieran, Rob and Simon, but starting with Kieran, is how do we remove some of that complexity? And do you have any tips for stakeholders for avoiding sort of common pitfalls when installing particularly charging infrastructure at scale?
Okay, good question, broad question. I think, to be honest with you, James, one of the biggest and simplest ways we can remove complexity is by having a building regulation in the first instance. So that's number one ticked. I think by removing the inconsistency that we see through the planning system would be a really good start as well, because we're going to see it with Part LNF that unfortunately local planning authorities will retain the autonomy to go over and above the building regulations. Now, that in itself brings different specifications and requirements. If say, the building regulation is a one-for-one basis, if you then have local planning restrictions that say, actually, no, you need 75% of your scheme on top of your minimum standard, that becomes complicated very quickly. So I think starting with the policy making, I think let's be clear on that. That would remove a lot of ambiguity in there as well. In terms of the internal criteria, in terms of technical specifications, obviously this new building regulation is a 7.2 kilowatt minimum charging point, as I understand it. Now, to be honest, I would suggest that most developers have been doing this for some time, which has been driven probably through the planning system rather than a building regulation, as we know. I think that in itself is reasonably simple. Obviously, we've seen criteria set out in the proposed building regulation in terms of the mode and the form of charging as well. I think in terms of internal distribution, in terms of wiring, etc., I think that's probably the area where I think there's probably a little bit of work to do, just making that as clear as possible for subcontractors to then install these charging points. And also the most important part here in terms of a residential sector is the consumer. Is it easy to use? Because we can all put these fantastic technologies in, think air source heat pumps or other sorts of heat pumps, but until they're easy to use, you will not get a consumer shift to take with you. So it's cultural in that respect as well. I think where we probably need to focus on some of the complexities is in managed schemes. So where we've got estate management schemes on board, and where you've got apartment schemes or you've got mixed use schemes as well, that will be key, because actually understanding who is responsible for the metering arrangements, who is responsible for the maintenance of the network in perpetuity, whether or not the on-plot parking is conveyed to the freeholder, or indeed it's actually rented from a pod point, for example. There's a good plug there, wasn't it? Or another. That's where I think we need to be clear, because one of the things that potentially holds up housing sales, in my experience, is the ambiguity over who owns and who maintains what. So if you can nail that stuff down early doors, and we've got a building regulation that goes a long way towards that, if you can nail that sort of ownership, maintenance in perpetuity piece, I think that will be key to this as well. So I think 2 strands or 3 strands: planning, I think installation requirements for subcontractors and consumer use, but then also the maintenance and management in perpetuity, I think would probably be key to it.
That's a very, very good answer. Rob, pull your finger out, mate. You've got to absolutely nail the ongoing legals around the ownership and operation of these things. So I expect that done by sometime tomorrow. Simon, I'm going to come to you. Same question, really. Any tips for developers, stakeholders to avoid potential pitfalls here?
From our perspective, it's fairly straightforward. We get, if you're talking a domestic property, you get an application to say this charge has been installed, and then it's kind of written that it's agreed. But generally, we're notified after the event. There is a lot of confusion when it's being retrofitted solutions, but you get people like PodPoint who deal with that process for the customer. So it takes it away from people that don't really know what they're doing to a team of people, or people that do know how to make these applications towards an IDNO or a DNO. So from our perspective, it's fairly straightforward on a domestic standpoint, but the slight not complication, again, from my point of view, but anything I can foresee, is when you've got a block of flats and you've got communal charging points, it's how that is used. Now, we're starting to, DNO perspective, we're starting to see a lot more of a block of flats being built and then a communal charging area. So that generally we see it as a certain capacity, and that may be split across the parking for each charger. That'd be individually metered at that point. So somebody needs to own that meter and pay the bill. The question being is that really, that if you own a house and you've got a driveway and you can plug your car in and you can pay 5p a kilowatt off-peak periods, then how is it going to work from someone owning that communal charger, where because they live in a flatted property, they could potentially be paying 40, 30p a kilowatt. So it might mean that something has to change with from a building standpoint, from like a management agent that works on behalf of the communal aspect. Again, it doesn't really affect us from an IDNO standpoint, but certainly from a customer's benefit. As soon as the cost drops, I've got an EV car, it cost me about 1.2p a mile. But if I was charging at 30p a mile, that's close enough to what I was doing in a petrol or a diesel car. So it certainly makes a big impact on how this, like Kieran said, the technology needs to be easy, and it also needs to be cheap effectively. So from our point of view, it doesn't really make much difference. It's just things I can see from the offset where it might impact a customer on the back end of it.
Awesome. Very well put. And Rob, finally to you. What are the sort of key tips you have to avoid potential pitfalls for stakeholders?
Yeah, I think good points from everyone else, and I guess that alludes to my point really, which is that there's lots of latent complexity, maybe in the new connection initially at the start of a project, and then moving over into how the consumer is going to interact with the infrastructure, actually how it's laid out as well. So we have the Part M regulations that relate to footpath width and things like this. So it can get quite nuanced and quite a battleground of legislation to fit these units into site in a way that we look after the size of the site, the efficiency of that layout, the efficiency of the power distribution, the interaction for the customer, the adopting property manager or factor as they're known in Scotland. There's quite a lot going on. So really my point there is early engagement and a willingness from the developers and their supply chain, their contractor base, their design teams as well to engage really with this subject and really start to understand it and lean on their EV charging supply chain for that expertise. So like Kieran alluded to, we've collectively as a community been navigating these local nuanced planning requirements for a while now. So we're kind of fairly battle worn in that respect, and we understand how these kind of pop up in different varieties and variations on different site types, whether it's blocks of flats or houses, etc. So early engagement to transfer that knowledge and knit it in with how your external lighting systems are going to be earthed, and does that have any implications for how your EV charging needs to be earthed, for example. Knitting that all together to bring it into shape and into practice early, so you can plan for it, budget for it, inform customers of it. It is really key. So early engagement to knit everything together, and then I think the final thing, something that we're really trying hard to get ahead of, is the customer engagement, and that goes through the developments or the developers' sales teams, and then actually direct engagement with the end customers after the fact as well, to make sure warranties are understood and make sure their interaction with a supplier's phone app and maybe our wider network as well, and they really see a smooth journey from practical completion of the development through to handover, ongoing operation, and all the complexity that comes with that, billing and reconciliation, etc., which we hope we have some really good answers for.
Great stuff. Well, excuse me, I may well come back to you for more on the operational phase. I think what you've really identified there is why you say you lead a team of consultants. It's not a sales team at this point. This is from a sales point, a very consultative sale. There's a lot of additional information, and that really key thing is get in early as you can in your development to plan for this. You are not going to be able to roll down to an electrical wholesaler, buy a bunch of these, wang them in, and away you go. You're going to have to understand your obligations for planning for grid, for ongoing maintenance, for et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, get in contact with Rob and his team. I'm sure his team are far more agreeable than he is if you're not enjoying him on this call. But how about that? Right, so I'm now going to move on to the Q&A section. And the first one is just clarifying a couple of other things in terms of the scope of the regs. Kieran had mentioned we're thinking around kind of June time it goes live. And Rob, you've just highlighted to me that we are England only, aren't we? We're not UK-wide at the moment. England is leading the way with maximum respect to the devolved administrations. It looks like this reg is getting here first in England, but I understand Scotland are doing something very, very similar, and we're expecting to see it roll out elsewhere. Grace, can you confirm everything I've just said, and can you give us a firm date when these regs go live?
So on the point you said about England only, yeah, that is right. It's devolved, but we are working with devolved administration colleagues. As you say, Scotland, I believe, has consultation live right now on their own considerations on policies on EV and charge points. I'm afraid that as the commencement date is going to be tied to the actual laying of the legislation itself for the end of the year, we can't give like a firm committed date, but we're looking at these applying no less than 6 months after this legislation is laid. So that would be looking at essentially June time, because we're intending to lay for the end of December. So I can't give a precise date, I'm afraid, on it, but there will be appropriate adjustment periods. So Kieran will be aware, and we've had in other previous engagement, we've discussed it about how home builders and developers can adjust to these changes in line with how it's similarly handled in previous changes to the building regulations as well, which we've taken on board to make sure that people have time to carry out these changes appropriately in England.
Great stuff. Thank you very much. I won't press you for a firm answer on date, although that'd be fun if you committed. A lot of the technical questions we've had are about the operational phase. So it might be Rob, it might be Kieran to come in on these ones, but questions like how does the handover work? How do drivers pay for their electricity moving forward? Who's responsible for the maintenance of the charging points when they're in operation? Would you like to come in on those points, Rob or Kieran?
Yeah, I guess I'll probably give it a go. Kieran, feel free to back me up. You'd be more than welcome. So I think the key emphasis here is that managing agents have not done this before. So and same for housing associations. So generally speaking, they're new to this and they're new to the complexity of reconciling power in this way, and new to how much power might be flowing through their meters and how much they might need to procure and at what rate, and the importance, for example, of off-peak pricing and how that might impact the experience, the financial experience for the resident that they're providing for. So there's lots of new territory here for them. Certainly the overwhelming feedback we've had from our clients over the past 5 years or so, really, as we've been growing into this space, has been, can you keep it as easy as possible for us, please? And then when we need you, can we pick up the phone? So that's definitely the way that we're setting ourselves up, is can we develop software that really makes it relatively hands-free? A couple of inputs in terms of how much is the energy going to cost and who do I want to provide access to? And then short of that, actually everything looks after itself in the background, with alerts and flags and reports and stuff to kind of offer up that information as the customer might see fit. So trying to keep it as low impact for the managing agent, who, let's not forget, has lots else going on in the property at any one time, and 100 residents, as nice as they may be, will always create noise and excitement around the next project, the next thing to do. And there's lots of pressures on properties at the moment. I also have the benefit of looking after the retrofit side of our business, looking at how do we retrofit these things into blocks of flats. And I know from having to create the budgets and then get the sign off for that, it can be a really, really difficult area to navigate. So making it as easy as possible for the managing agent to enjoy and engage with the technology from a hardware perspective and a software perspective, and then having a friendly face on the end of a phone call should they need it is critical, basically.
Great stuff. Anything to add?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say I completely agree with Rob there. Simplicity is absolutely key to this, both for developer, so the actual contractor, and indeed the consumer or the customer in that respect as well. If you look for some parity, a comparison here is feed-in tariffs on photovoltaic panels on roofs. Personally, I find them a nightmare. I've got a 2-year-old house, a new build house, and the feed-in tariff, the metering, the sub-metering, it's a nightmare. It's just not clear enough. There's a lot of onus on the consumer to go through a lot of paperwork. And as Rob said, what you want is the simplicity to pick up the phone, either when you're a developer, a managing agent, or a customer, to just say, have I got this working right? Have I got it, optimized in the right way? And if there's any problems, can I call you and can you come out and have a look at it? And that's all you want, because without doing this a disservice, it's a plug socket for a car, right? So we don't want to overcomplicate it. So simplicity is absolutely key. There's obviously a lot more to it than that, and I appreciate that. But
not a lot, Kieran. Let's be honest. No. It's got a radio strap to it. That's about it. But don't tell anyone.
But the way feed-in tariffs, the way PV panels have been introduced, and rightly so, the way that's been done with the various energy suppliers, etc., it is a complicated process in terms of metering and feeding in, etc., as well. And I think if we can avoid replicating that process and that sort of bureaucracy in that respect as well, I think that will also be key to this.
Great stuff. Grace, that's probably on you. Might be between Bays and Ofgem. If you could resolve that for Kieran on the feed-in tariff side, that'd be absolutely magic. Right, couple of questions about costs. One person saying, who is expected to pay these additional costs for uprating grid, etc.? And will this make the houses more expensive? Who would like to come in on that?
I'm happy to take a bit of a go at it in terms of the point on will this make housing more expensive. This is in large part why when we consulted on this, we really did want to outline appropriate exemptions to make sure that it was proportional. So we've already cited the 3,600 figure, and that was 3 times what we thought was actually a fair estimation of the installation of a charge point would cost. And by putting in this exemption and also similar exemptions that are about the number of spaces that are actually there and when to seek cable routes instead if there's insufficient power supply, we're hoping that this leads to less direct cost added as a result of these charge points being introduced. And we also think that for example, for first-time buyers or anything like this, that the government is working in many other ways to ensure that access to housing and housing purchases are appropriate and accessible. So we've designed it with these exemptions to try and minimise any risk of this. And we also think that the cost savings more generally of moving to EV vehicles, we've already cited the I think it was 5p versus the average cost of using an ICE vehicle. We also think that actually that's going to be a really big cost saving as well built in that element. So I'm sure that other people on the panel will be able to give more detail, but the exemptions are really there to ensure that this doesn't have a big knock-on effect on the price of the house disproportionately.
Indeed. So hopefully not too burdensome, but still some cost, guys. Who pays?
I think certainly from the house building industry perspective, obviously Part S, the electric vehicle charging piece, is one part of a very big picture. There is a cumulative burden at the moment, which is affecting our industry significantly. So all the way from Part S, electric vehicle charging, to biodiversity net gain, residential property developer tax, building safety levy, and the plethora of regulation and policy coming down the track. So we need to manage that because we need to still be viable. We need to be profit-making enterprises in order to regenerate new homes as well. So it needs careful consideration, not in isolation as well. Am I saying that revenues or sales prices will go up? No, not necessarily. But we need to be aware of this cumulative impact on the regulatory landscape and what that does to properties and supply and demand curves as well.
I think that's very fair, Kieran. I mean, ultimately, the developer pays and that gets passed on to the customer at the end. And certainly, we don't need any more expensive housing in the UK at the moment. The one thing I would say for electric vehicle charging points is that it may well hold their value, because I think they're going to be very, very useful moving forward. Now, I have a very specific technical question that I would like Symon to come in on. And that was, what is the time frame in which developers can safeguard the network capacity they need to provide these EV charge points and not have that capacity reallocated by the DNO? So if we're going to put a ton of charging points in, EV uptake, we're bullish, but we're still, we're not at 100% by this point. So we don't expect them to see them all used in the next sort of 3 or so years. There's a danger that capacity may be reallocated. How's that going to play out, Symon?
So usually speaking, a development so somebody will apply for a point of connection onto the existing network. That then will dictate what voltage is connected out, and depending on the load that's required. Once that's done, and generally the developer or the connection provider pays that kickstarts the connection process. Part of that connection process is something called a bilateral connection agreement. That bilateral connection agreement is an agreement between an IDNO, such as ourselves, and the upstream DNO. Now, that ties the capacity to that development, because the realization is, if you've got 1,000 plot development, they're not all being built in year one, right? You'd be lucky, 1,000 plot development may take 8 years, say. So they can't just restrict that element of capacity at that point of connection. So with the BCA, that covers us for that standpoint. The only time there's other methods. If it's an I&C load, that's quite a large, say like a large EV charging station. Then we predict that we're going to be at 1 kVA and all the way up to 10 MVA, and then you can have a ramping agreement put in place through the IDNO, which then replicates through to the DNO. DNOs generally don't offer that. They give you the capacity and you pay for it from day one. So we've got a little bit of flexibility there. From a domestic standpoint, the BCA is in place. We've got the allocation of that load. There should be no way of taking that load away under the BCA agreement.
And just BCA stands for again?
Bilateral connection agreement.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I'm sure everyone else got that, but me. Happy days. I am conscious we're coming to the end of our panel. We have so many questions here that unfortunately we aren't going to get to, but a few seem to recur, and I might end with you, Rob, on this one. And we've got questions from people who live in some multi-tenancy dwellings at the moment. We've talked about the challenges of new build versus retrofit. Indeed, we may well have to do some retrofit under this legislation, because we're talking about major renovations to existing buildings, etc. Rob, can you just come in and tell us how you see that playing out? Are you optimistic? Most of the built environment does exist. Trying to get charging infrastructure into it is going to be a challenge. Are you optimistic we'll be able to get this done? As we've highlighted, a lot of the challenges, even when we're putting in a new development, how hard is it going to be for the existing?
Yeah, I guess I'll break the retrofit environment into two. So the first really is the bit that Grace alluded to before, where there's a major renovation of an existing building, but typically there you've shipped all the residents out, and you don't have all the kind of politics and noise that might come with that, and you're able to strip it clean, maybe bring in new points of connection, and almost treat it as the bones that you're trying to wrap with a new skin. That can be materially easier in many respects, because you're not dealing with balancing service charge considerations and tenants and that sort of thing. The second half, though, is the existing property stock that we have, and clearly we have lots of that existing property stock where you do have lots of tenants, either in social housing or in a nice private block of flats in any of our major cities. That is really quite challenging, because the power is never designed in situ, speaking generally, of course. The car parks, you would think a car park is very similar to the next one. I can tell you now, having been in thousands of them, they're all different. So the nuances around the services that are hanging on the ceiling or underneath the floor or on the wall, where you might wish to run your cable work and your trays, etc., that all needs really detailed consideration. and then how you then bring in the technologies on top, maybe bringing Wi-Fi into the basement so that you can have interesting building techniques that will take the day-to-day stress and management away from the managing agent. It's an additional consideration here. We've never had Wi-Fi in basements before, and we need to get our heads around that sort of thing as well. So there's lots of these bits that are really challenging. Grace and her team have been working really hard on a slightly different bit of legislation to provide a grant and a subsidy against those environments, so that we'll have a grant of up to £30,000 per property that will basically take the edge off that and try and equalise the population. So if you live in a block of flats, it's no longer exceedingly expensive to retrofit in. There will be a plan that your property manager can implement alongside a charge point provider, and then you will be able to draw down against that plan in a much more economically viable way, and also in a way where the property manager has one plan for the property rather than cables from 10 different suppliers running in 10 different directions. So they have one plan, one maintenance regime, one operation regime, a clear, distinct way of reconciling tariffs, clarity for all stakeholders involved.
And I'm sure that will be available to a certain clearly defined number of people. I guess that we're hoping that acts as kind of a seed fund for the wider existing built environment. Is that fair?
Yeah, correct. It's been really challenging. Whilst the utilisation remains fairly low, it's really challenging to install in these environments because, of course, you always have 100 residents and 10, 15, 20 of them are really keen as mustard to do this. You might have another 20 or 30 that can see the benefit, but actually we need to fix the electric gate first. And then the other 50% of the population aren't quite up to speed. So we really struggle to unlock that service charge and prioritise it over and above other prevailing forces like cladding, for example, that's taken up a very significant amount of attention and budget, quite rightly, over the past 3 to 5 years. So there's been lots of kind of headwinds that we've been struggling against, and some support from Grace and her team at OZEV is really, really welcome to get over the hurdle, develop the technologies, and get us started. Yeah,
that's fantastic. I'm afraid I'd love to bring in Grace to give us a bit more information on that from our side, but maybe another time, maybe another Electric Insights. It just remains for me to say thank you so much to our panel. Thank you to Grace, thank you to Kieran, thank you to Rob, and thank you to Symon.
Thanks very much as well for chairing, James.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Cheers.
Thank you, James.
Cheers, James.